Class is in session, boys. So I recently installed an oil catch can on the forged S52, and a lot of you guys had questions about catch cans. Some of you guys didn't know what catch cans were. Some of you guys maybe heard of them but never really taken the time to figure out what they are and learn about them. So we're just gonna do like an oil catch can in a nutshell, kind of explaining like the basics of operation and what they do and how they work and all that fun stuff. Now, before we start talking about what catch cans do, we need to understand PCV and CCV systems on four-stroke engines and sort of what they do. CCV stands for crankcase ventilation. PCV stands for positive crankcase ventilation. They're basically the same thing. So here we have a piston, technically a piston and rod assembly. You should understand how a four-stroke engine works. This isn't the video for that, but we're going to do like a brief. So the piston goes down, the intake valve opens, air and fuel get pulled in by the piston going down. Piston goes up, compresses the air-fuel mixture, and then you have ignition, then the power stroke, the gases expand and push the piston down, creating power, and then exhaust stroke, the piston goes back up, the exhaust valves open, and all of that exhaust gases fuck off, and that happens a bunch of times and you go fast. Well, in a perfect world, all of the exhaust gases, all of the combustion gases that happen on top of this piston would push the piston down, creating power. Well, we don't really live in a perfect world, so a little bit of those gases that are designed to push the piston down actually go past the piston instead of pushing the piston down. And this happens every power stroke on basically every piston. So gases explode and a little bit goes past the piston, right? Now into this little area underneath the piston. Now what's attached here is the crankshaft, right? So you have all of this negative space, it's just air space in there. Because the crankshaft has to move, there has to be places for this piston to go up and down and the rod to swing around. And so there's all of this empty space inside the engine underneath the piston, right? So where all of your oil sits and all that stuff. So here we have some cardboard, and I'm not an art major, so this is going to be fairly rudimentary. We have, let's say that's your engine block, right? So you see that? And it's as basic as it can get. And then you have your oil pan, like that, right? And then you have your crankshaft kind of in the middle like that. And so there's a whole bunch of negative space in here which just has block, and you of course have your cylinder head and your valve cover like that. All of this, it kind of looks like a case, right? It's encasing the crankshaft, right? So there's your crankcase. So when we talk about crankcase, it is all of the negative space inside the engine that air can move around in. So now those gases that go past the piston is not just air, right? So there's air there, but there's also vaporized fuel vapors. And if you've ever taken your oil cap off when the motor's hot, you'll notice that there's a little bit of smoke. And sometimes motor oil, when it gets hot, it just sort of smokes. So what you have in all of this negative space, what you have inside the crankcase, is air, you have fuel vapor, and you have oil vapor, all just sort of hanging around, floating around inside the engine. And every time the piston fires, you have a little bit more air and oil, and more and more and more as the engine runs for longer periods of time. Now, if this was a completely enclosed crankcase, if there was no way for that air and oil vapor to get out, that would be really bad. Why? Because the engine runs at a little bit around 200 degrees, so there's heat there, there's pressure constantly pushing new gases into the engine, and there's gasoline vapors inside of there. So if you had a sealed crankcase, a completely sealed crankcase, then your engine, the inside of your engine would basically just be a bomb. At some point there'd be enough pressure and enough fuel there for the whole thing to just explode. Now that never really happens. If you ever had a PCV valve get stuck closed and the pressure builds up inside of here, it's going to start blowing out gaskets and blowing out front and rear main seals way before the whole thing would ever blow up. But the important thing to know is there is fuel vapor and oil vapor just sort of floating around inside the engine as this thing is running. And so that's why there are systems, that's what the CCV system, crankcase ventilation system, is designed to vent the crankcase. It's designed to get all of that oil vapor and all of that fuel vapor out of inside the engine so it doesn't sit there and just sort of fester, you know. And so that's what crankcase ventilation systems are. It's basically just a system that is designed to pull all of that vapor out of the crankcase and get rid of it. And so if you ever worked on an E36 or pulled your intake manifold off, mainly on the OBD2 cars, this is your PCV valve, your CCV valve, crankcase ventilation valve. So here is your tube that goes to the valve cover, which sucks all of that stuff in here. And then this guy goes into the intake manifold. So the intake manifold has vacuum as the engine is running, and that vacuum is literally sucking all of that oil and all of that fuel vapor out of the engine to get rid of it. Now on the bottom here we have an oil separator, so in the event that liquid oil gets into this vent valve, the liquid oil just falls to the bottom, and there's a little hose right here that gets attached to the oil pan dipstick basically. And so all the liquid oil that would ever get in here just sort of falls back into the oil pan. So all of that oil and fuel vapor that go into the crankcase go through this guy, which is basically a little spring-loaded vacuum check valve, and then it goes into the intake manifold to get burned off with the rest of the combustion cycle. So all of that oil vapor and all that fuel vapor that's in your engine just gets pumped back into the intake manifold and then just gets burned off out the exhaust basically. This PCV check valve in here is actually very important, and this is one of the reasons why I spent a lot of time integrating my actual OE PCV valve into my catch can setup. Now again, you have fuel vapor coming through this crankcase ventilation system, and there's fuel vapor inside of that engine, right? Now in the event of a backfire, and I'm not talking about exhaust popping backfire, I'm talking about a true backfire. A true backfire by definition is when an expansion of gases or like a combustion explosion happens inside of the intake manifold. A true backfire is in the intake manifold, not in the exhaust manifold. Exhaust manifold popping is commonly referred to as backfire, but it's actually technically called afterfire. So in the event of a true backfire, where you have a fireball going through the intake manifold, that rarely happens on EFI cars. It's more common with carbureted cars. But in the event of a backfire, this PCV valve will snap shut and not allow air to go back into the PCV valve. So this valve is a one-way check valve basically. It only lets air go in through and out. It doesn't let go air in this way. Because if you had a fireball coming into the intake manifold and it decided to go through here and then into the crankcase, well, you have a 200-degree crankcase full of fuel vapor, and that fucking sucks, right? So that is what the PCV system is basically designed to do. It's designed to pull fuel and oil vapor out of the crankcase and then into the intake manifold just to get burned off. And that's why, if you guys have ever noticed, if you've ever had any weird vacuum leaks from your car, for instance, the tube that goes to the valve cover from this is cracked, or you have a valve cover gasket leak, and you have a lean code or a misfire, or your car's not idling right, that is technically a vacuum leak, because this PCV system is attached to the intake manifold. If it does have a vacuum leak through the PCV or the valve cover, it can cause idling issues. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what a crankcase ventilation system is. The cons of a crankcase ventilation system are that it burns that fuel and oil vapor up into the intake manifold, and more importantly through the engine, right? And so that's where catch cans come into play. Fuel vapor burns nicely. It doesn't really leave a lot of carbon deposits behind, but oil, engine oil, leaves carbon deposits behind when it does get burned. So that oil vapor that gets sucked through the intake manifold and then goes through the engine actually leaves carbon deposits. And if you've ever pulled a cylinder head or an engine apart, you will notice that there is carbon basically everywhere. So on the top of this piston, this is the original S52 piston that was in my motor before we rebuilt it. You'll notice all of these black carbon deposits. If you ever looked at the top of a cylinder head, the valves are covered with carbon, so is the dome on the top of the cylinder head, and the exhaust manifold, or the exhaust runner in the cylinder head, is just caked with all of this carbon stuff. Now, this isn't really an issue for most cars. If you're running an NA car, this isn't really an issue, but when you're building a high horsepower turbo motor, you really don't want these carbon deposits here. The main reason is, as you can tell just by looking at it, the carbon deposits didn't really form evenly on the entire piston. So there's like this spot right here didn't get any, this spot is a little light, this spot is like super thick, and it's just kind of patchy where it develops. And if you even look at this on like a microscope, at a microscopic level, you will see like mountains and valleys and different heights of the carbon building up. It doesn't form a uniform layer across the entire piston. And for a high horsepower turbo car, that is an issue, because those little peaks and those little tips can become hot spots when the motor is running. And if it gets to a point where it stays hot, like you have a little piece of carbon that just stays hot like that, that can almost act like a spark plug in some extreme cases, where it will literally the fuel mixture when it's being compressed. If you ever heard of pre-ignition or detonation or engine knock, this is what you're kind of talking about, when something is igniting the air-fuel mixture before the spark plug has a chance to, and this can be detrimental and it can destroy pistons, and it's just really bad. So that is why carbon buildup is awful for high horsepower turbo motors. Even on like stock NA motors, this isn't a super huge issue, and most of the common turbo cars you see, this isn't really an issue, but when you're going for really high horsepower numbers, this can be an engine killer basically. And so an oil catch can is basically a can that gets plugged into or replaces the crankcase ventilation system. My catch can is installed in the car, so for theoretical purposes, this is my catch can. So you have a hose coming from the valve cover into the can, and then you have a hose coming out of the valve cover into the intake manifold or into wherever you're venting the crankcase. And inside this can there's going to be a whole bunch of filter elements that are designed to filter out the oil and the fuel vapor from just the air. It's basically an oil separator, a vapor separator. So you have the hose coming in, and this hose has air and it has oil vapor and it has fuel vapor, and all of that stuff goes into the can. The filter elements inside the catch can will filter out the oil vapor and the fuel vapor, and then only air will come out of the can and then into the intake manifold. So when you're venting with a catch can, only air is going to be going into the intake manifold, and you don't have to worry about carbon building up on the inside of your pistons. And that's basically what a catch can setup is designed to do. Now, running a catch can is important for high horsepower turbo builds. Even more so, it's important for direct injection engines. These engines here, E36 engines are EFI port injection, so their fuel injectors are sitting in the intake manifold spraying onto the intake runner. Now, if you've ever pulled an intake manifold on one of these cars, you'll notice that the intake runners on the cylinder head are not really caked up with carbon, and that's because they're port injection. That's because the intake runners on the cylinder head are constantly being sprayed by fuel. So if oil ever tries to settle onto the intake runner in the cylinder head, immediately there's fuel there just washing it away. So it doesn't build up as heavily as it does on the pistons. Now, some of the first generation and even some of the newer direct injection engines have a huge problem with this. Their crankcase ventilation systems are designed to vent into the intake manifold like a port injection engine. Unlike a port injection engine, their fuel injector is inside the cylinder. It's literally inside the cylinder next to the spark plug. And because of that, because there's no fuel constantly washing on the intake runners, they have a huge problem with carbon buildup on the intake runners that port injection cars don't have. So I know some of the first gen 335s, I don't know if BMW has fixed this with their newer cars, but about every 60 to 80,000 miles, people have to take their 335s or their direct injection BMWs in, and even some cars like the Audi B8s have this issue as well. And they would have to pull the intake manifold off and walnut blast the intake runners on the cylinder head. It's basically like soda blasting or sand blasting to get all the carbon deposits up. Because it's a restriction and because it causes drivability issues, you're down on power because the carbon just sits there and builds up. And so it's more important if you have a direct injection engine than if you have a port injection engine. But if you're doing any like crazy build, turbo build, where you don't want excessive heat in the cylinder or you don't want ignition knock or any issues like that, then you should definitely run a catch can. There are a lot of even E36 NA guys who run cans just for that specific reason, because it keeps the engine running a little bit better than it would if you just had a factory PCV valve. So that's basically what catch cans in a nutshell do. They prevent carbon from building up in places you don't want carbon to be built up, and it just sort of cleans out the whole engine as a whole. As far as pros go, that's basically the biggest pro of running a can, is that you won't have carbon buildup all inside your engine. It'll all be catched inside the can. The only real drawback of a catch can is that it needs to be serviced. You do need to drain it. So about every time you change your oil, you do need to drain the catch can. So that requires like unscrewing the bottom of the can and basically draining it out. And depending on how well you mount it, it can be a pain in the ass or it can be. If you mount it somewhere where you have to take the whole thing apart just to separate it, to drain the can, then it is a big pain in the ass. But if you strategically mount it, like I mounted mine, all I have to do is reach in, unspin it, and drain it. So that's basically the only drawback of owning a can. On any real proper build, the benefits far outweigh the pain in the ass it is to maintenance the can, which it really honestly isn't that big of a pain in the ass. Now, there are a lot of cans out there, and there are a lot of cheap cans out there if you're going to get one. The only ones that I would say don't get is the cans that return all of the shit that it captures to the oil sump. I've seen a lot of cans out there that have little drains that says, oh, you never have to service this can, it just drains all of that shit right back into the oil pan. The shit that comes out of the can is shit you do not want in your oil system. So if you're going to get a can, don't get one that drains back into the pan, because it captures absolute shit. Sometimes it'll even capture like moisture and water in there, so you'll have like, it'll look like a blown head gasket basically, and it's just full of little shit you just don't want in your engine. So that is catch cans in a nutshell. They basically just keep your engine clean. Let me know if you guys have any questions down in the comments. I will see you guys next time. Thank you guys so much for watching. Keep it fresh, and I'll see you guys later.
We are dreaming in the dark. We are nothing more than dust.